Hey guys, so I just set up a .tech domain name. It's chrishawks.tech, and it's the new thing that companies and organizations are now using for a very technology-centered domain name. So companies like Intel and Viacom have switched over. Organizations such as Consumer Electronics Show have switched from a .org domain name to a .tech. And if you guys are interested in also trying to buy and reserve your domain names before they are all purchased up, check out the link in the description tab below. It is a 90% discount on being able to purchase those. Hey guys, what's up? So in this video, I'm talking about the skills that you need to know in 2019 to be a web developer. And when I say web developer, I mean more than just like HTML, JavaScript, and CSS. A lot of boot camps and things like that, they'll kind of gloss over like the basics of being a web developer, but there are three core concepts that everybody's going to talk about, and that's HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Everybody knows about it, I'm sure, at this point. Shit, I mean, from way back in like MySpace days, we knew all about like CSS and HTML. But here you can see like, good w3schools.com, not the best site, but it's a decent learning tool. But you have HTML, which is the actual skeleton of the web, CSS, and then you have JavaScript, which is the dynamic functionality behind really the only programming language that runs in the browser. So those three being said are pretty obvious, I think, for most people, but that's not what this video is about. It's more about like where you should focus on specifically. So if you know that those three are absolutely core, then spend a few days with that, but then you'll be ready to go. I recommend Visual Studio Code as your editor of choice. There's really no reason to use anything else. Now, if you want to use like a paid option, there's like WebStorm. Now, if you're in like a full stack Java environment, then you're probably going to be using Eclipse, but you could still use Visual Studio Code in conjunction with that, as well as if you're in a .NET environment using something like Visual Studio, the IDE integrated development environment, which is not the same thing. But Visual Studio Code is definitely an industry leader. So whether you're writing Python, PHP, Go, it doesn't matter. Like there's extensions for it, and it just works really well for everything. So the next thing is Chrome. Everybody should be developing in Chrome. Chrome has the best developer tools. You can use Firefox, I suppose, but there's really, if you're just getting started, then definitely jump into Chrome. Chrome's going to have everything you need. There's all kinds of stuff that you can do here. Like in performance here, you can actually do all kinds of stuff where if you go ahead and start recording the performance, you could actually get profiling, figure out where your network latency is and things like that. There's all kinds of stuff in here in the console where you can actually hello with a W on the end. You can actually type and execute your JavaScript right inside the browser. You can make actual HTML and CSS changes. So I can edit as HTML and go in here and start like changing this to Chris. All right, and if I click off of that, you can see the new Chris, and then I can go ahead and add some styling to it over here. Give it a color of red. All right, and then it picks up on red. If I click red, I can go ahead and start dragging around. You can see I'm changing the colors around of the title. So there, I just redesigned the Chrome web page just like that. So Chrome Developer Tools, the best thing out there. So I'll go ahead and jump into the Chrome extensions. So Chrome has all kinds of extensions available that are free to make your development life easier. A lot of tools that I use are the Reactive Tools. So anytime you're doing some like React or Redux work, you can see I have the Redux Dev Tools here as well. So little extensions you can add on to make all your development easier. All right, so next you have Photoshop. Now, like you need some sort of photo editor, and Photoshop is obviously an industry standard, and it can be relatively complex. I've been using it for many years, so I use Photoshop all the time, almost on a daily basis. But there are free alternatives if you can't afford to get Photoshop. One of the best free alternatives is GIMP, and this is cross-platform and it works. Not nearly as intuitive as Photoshop in my opinion, but a lot of people that really know GIMP and don't know Photoshop say the same thing about Photoshop. So next, you need to be familiar with Git and version control. Here you can see I have some different projects here, just basic stuff, but these are just repositories, and I have a Git account. But Git being the version control system that I use to keep track of everything. And Git itself is a free program, but it's an industry standard. So there are other version control systems, but this keeps track of all the different code changes that you have, and it keeps track of major team environments. So some of the most sophisticated software out there, you can see like Netflix writing some of the most sophisticated software out there, is using Git. Everybody's using Git. So as a beginner web developer, if you're really trying to get in this industry and learn what everybody else is using, there's no reason to skip over Git or version control. I think you should jump into that as soon as possible. Next, you have all kinds of product collaboration tools. There's things for wireframes and things like that. InVision is a popular tool that's being used for design collaboration. So if you guys want to get started with a free account here, you can see that a lot of different companies are actually using this to share digital resources. All right, the next thing is HTML5 source maps. I can't stress this enough. People that don't know how to use source maps, it kills me. There's no way to do modern web development without source maps, so make sure you spend some time with that. All right, so the next thing is going to be CSS Animation. CSS now is adding all kinds of new capabilities every day. There's different types of layouts. CSS Grid and also CSS Flexbox are some of the latest updates to CSS itself. So trying to stay up to date on some of those newer features of CSS are pretty important as well. But CSS animations will continue to get bigger with time. Everybody needs to have Node.js installed on their machine. There should be no UI project that's being spun up without an init file, some sort of package.json, or using Yarn. So if you're using Node, you need to use npm or Yarn, but those are package managers that you need to use to structure your project, keep track of all your project's dependencies. Yarn is the tried and true industry standard. I would still recommend that at this point, but I'm sorry, npm is the recommended standard, but Yarn is the new kid on the block and has some new features, but npm has kind of made some improvements as well. I personally just stick with npm. So next, you need to be familiar with module bundling. So Webpack is the industry standard when it comes to that. So understand how to bundle different JavaScript files together, why that's a benefit. And whether or not you use it to compile your Sass or less code or something like that, then that's going to be up to you. But definitely at least use Webpack enough to be able to compile together some JavaScript files. All right, so the next thing is going to be familiar with a CSS library. So one of the industry standards is Bootstrap 4. Bootstrap 4 is now making use of the popular CSS features like Flexbox. It deals with all the responsive aspects of your website. So what does responsive mean? Well, it means when you look at this as a cell phone, this is another thing that Chrome Developer Tools gives you the ability to do. You can view your website and what it looks like on a cell phone. So if you use the Bootstrap kit, you can see it actually displays very nicely on all these different views. So it's designed that way on purpose, and it uses something called CSS media queries. That's something that came on the block in like 2011. And it kind of blew up with this whole responsive web design thing, and Bootstrap took off. And to this day, we have other CSS libraries, but Bootstrap 4 is the industry standard. And that being said, it also uses Sass now. So it used to use less as a CSS prepiler, but I would also recommend that you spend some time learning Sass because everybody's using it in the industry. And most new projects should not be using raw CSS because it's very hard to maintain. Sass gives you the ability to have functions in your CSS. It gives you the ability to have better imports. You have variables and things like that you normally do not have in the CSS language or specification. So the next thing to spend some time with in 2019 is the newest standard of JavaScript, which is called ES6. There's now an ES7 and an ES8 that they're talking about, but ES6 has all kinds of new features. This array.find is new. There's constants. There's lets, which has lexical scoping. There's the arrow functions with automatic this binding. There's just a lot of new features. However, they don't all work in the old browser. So you want to write your code in modern ES6, but then you need to transpile it to an older version. But you're not going to have to do that manually. You're going to want to do that with a tool like Babel. So everybody in the industry is using Babel to transfer new syntax to old syntax. So if I said constant x equals this is a const, and you could see it turns it to a var because var, the constant keyword is not supported in all the browsers. So depending on what browsers you're trying to support, Babel will handle all that work for you, and it also works very well with Webpack. Now, a lot of companies are upset with the fact that JavaScript does not have static typing. So we have this thing called Babel Flow. And Flow now brings static typing to the JavaScript language. A lot of people love it or hate it, but that's something that a lot of teams are doing it. And a lot of teams that don't do that, they're getting into TypeScript. So TypeScript is the other alternative to ES6, which is really its own separate language. But just like Babel and ES6 being transpiled, TypeScript does the same thing. but the language gives you static typing, it gives you interfaces, it gives you classes and all kinds of stuff. Well, classes are now available in ES6, but it gives you a lot of things that aren't available in normal JavaScript. So once you have that modern ES6 syntax under your belt and you're able to transpile it just fine, then you're going to have to figure out how to do that with React code. So you don't have to choose React, but React is the front runner of all three major client-side libraries that most projects are being written in. And there's really just three, I would say at this point, the three major contenders, React being number one at this point, Angular being number two. Some people might disagree with the 1 and 2 there. And then I would say, no doubt, Vue number 3. But those three are all client-side frameworks, and they do a lot of different stuff for you. And you can see they're using classes. They're using all the modern ES6 syntax that doesn't work in browsers. So all this stuff has to be transpiled. In addition to that, if you're going to use React, you have to learn how to use JSX. So you can see that this stuff isn't proper HTML. It's actually something... It's an HTML JavaScript hybrid called JSX, and you're going to have to learn how to use that if you want to use React. But that is, you want to pick one of those frameworks, though, and learn that. All right, so the next thing that you're going to want to be familiar with is ESLint. So ESLint or PyLint, if you're doing Python development, or if you're even any sort of development, if you're doing a lot of C# development, StyleCop is a popular tool that enforces syntax, but developers write code differently, and major companies don't like that to happen because everybody should be writing the code the same way. So that way, when you jump into a project, if everybody's writing it the same way, it's easier for everybody to grasp and start writing code. But it doesn't always work that way. So we have to have these tools that basically monitor the code that's being written, and then it's flagging for errors like, oh, you didn't follow this specific syntax and things like that. You can identify all the rules for what those are, and different teams identify different rules, but understanding what linting is and why it exists is absolutely important for any web developer in 2019. So the next thing that you're going to want to also spend some time with is unit testing. You're expected to unit test your code in almost any production environment out there for any tech company, any business company that has a large tech presence. You're going to be unit testing your code. And there's these unit testing libraries that are available for all the different languages. So popular with React and JavaScript and ES6 would be Jest. But then there's all kinds of different testing frameworks as well. Like with Visual Studio, you have built-in testing environments. Like this is Visual Studio right here. So you can see I have this test, and I have an entire test explorer here that's built in to Visual Studio. And right now I don't have a test project set up in here or any test set up, but all this stuff is built into Visual Studio, the IDE itself, because you do have to write your code. And there's all kinds of different libraries out there for unit testing. The two, and for JavaScript, since we're dealing with just JavaScript testing, I would say that the two are Jest and Mocha, and those are two of the front runners. All right, so the next thing you're going to have some familiarity with is going to be a server. So servers are going to be what actually serve your content. I have a Django website. Right now, my website is completely taken down. I'm actually rewriting it for a tutorial series I'm doing. But this particular website, it just has an ad on it or whatever. But it's a Python Django website. It's sitting on a virtual private server in New Jersey for a company called Linode. And the server is running Python, and the static content, meaning all the images in JavaScript and CSS, are being delivered by Nginx. The rest of the Python content is being delivered by Apache 2. And then the database is Postgres, and then it's using React and a bunch of other stuff as well. So any sort of modern website, and this is not even a modern website, I'm not trying to like show that off or anything, but any website that you're building is going to be using all of these tools. And for being able to put all those together, you're definitely a full stack developer. And you could definitely call yourself a web developer for sure and get a job if you're able to put all this stuff together. But just understanding how basic web servers work is important. Like with Apache, I have a virtual private server, and I have roughly like 14 domains sitting on one VPS. So that means I have to set up a bunch of virtual hosts, and like knowing enough about setting up firewalls, virtual hosts, and things like that. That's more of a full stack thing and not really web developer, but at least understanding some of the basic functionality of how web servers work is important, because I can't stress enough the network panel of Chrome developer tools. Every request that's made to a server, you could see the endpoint that was reached. You could see the response, this HTTP status code. understanding RESTful services and requests and responses and cookies and all those things. Those are all things that are going to be hugely important to web development. In this video alone, I can't possibly go into all that stuff. And I know I just glossed over like really something I could probably write a novel about with request responses, RESTful services, APIs, things like that. But just know in this modern day and age, the UIs are all about client-side JavaScript communicating with slimmed down microservices. So microservices being something like, like if we look at something like, so if we looked at a website like Spotify is most likely running some sort of, like this website. I mean, we could probably inspect it and look around and try to figure out what sort of CSS and everything it's running. But this thing's going to be probably using like Bootstrap and React or some sort of client-side library. The actual music itself is all going to be just simply API endpoints on some sort of web frameworks. Web framework being like if you're going to be a Microsoft shop, then it's going to be ASP.NET. ASP.NET is all written in C#, and it's going to be most likely housed on an Azure database. So Azure is the cloud provider for really, I mean, it's the top two. So AWS and Azure are the top two for cloud hosting, and all the companies are using them. So if you're able to get really good with their technologies like Visual Studio, building C# ASP.NET projects and deploying that to Azure environments and understanding how to set up Azure environments and firewalls and rules and permissions, if you become even moderately successful at that, like you can make a lot of money in this industry for sure. There's so much opportunity there in these cloud hosting environments to help companies set up their environments in these cloud environments, and then help them transition their data from existing data centers over to these new cloud environments and things like that. Tons of money in that. So again, Azure, AWS, .NET Core would be the Microsoft route. So the alternative is like Java. You can go AWS. So like the AWS is owned by Amazon. Again, it's very, very complicated, but if you wanted to go this route where you're setting up a bunch of websites for AWS or Azure, you most definitely will get a job in the industry if you could figure that stuff out. There's also Heroku and some other cloud providers. I personally use Linode, like I said, but just having a basic web server available for your own self-learning and things like that, I think is important. All right, so the next thing to be familiar with is this is WebGL, and I'm actually controlling this, the macaroni noodles, or at least the camera of it with my mouse. So this is using 3D technology that is an OpenGL specification. So when it comes to web graphics and any sort of computing, there's basically two. There's Direct 3D and then there's OpenGL. So the OpenGL specification kind of won out, and it was the specification that got used by the browsers when they created this WebAssembly. And WebAssembly gives the browser the ability to communicate directly with your graphics card to run the intense calculations that are needed to do the mathematical calculations and vertices and things like that are being calculated to display this type of thing. So WebGL gives us that ability. But the new kid on the block is going to be WebAssembly. And WebAssembly is going to be even faster than, really WebAssembly itself is a bytecode that's going to run inside the browser, but it's going to use and communicate with WebGL as well. So it's kind of this huge approach to modernize browsers to make them more advanced so that we could have virtual reality one day in the browsers as we shop for stuff on Amazon. All right, so the next thing that you want to be familiar with is you need some sort of server-side language. So you can pick anything you want, but your server can run whatever you want it to run. But really, it should be a Python server or a PHP server or C# or Java or something like that. And then it's going to spin up a web framework. You should just pick a web framework out there. So if you're using Python, you want to use Django. And then with Django, then you're going to want to pretty much rip out most of its templating system, set it up to be mostly a microservice API kind of endpoint that's passing back and forth JSON data, communicating with the database and such. And then have most of your UI just be like a React, Vue, or Angular type of front-end framework using the tools that I just described, like Webpack and Babel and stuff like that. Also, if you guys are interested in seriously like how to do all this stuff, I'll be posting pretty soon an entire tutorial series that I cover everything, and it's almost done. So literally in just one series, I think it teaches way more than what really colleges teach when it comes to coding and what's going on right now. All right, so the next thing you want to be familiar with is database systems. Databases, you can't stress the importance of that enough. Like, I mean, all programming is extracting data, translating it, and moving it along. So but ultimately that data has to live somewhere, and it lives in different databases around the world on different, all kinds of different servers with different database systems. Postgres is a very popular database system. MySQL is another one that's very popular, both being free. IIS is SQL Server is an industry standard for the Microsoft development environment, and really even shops that don't just use Microsoft exclusively still use SQL Server. But ultimately, your data is going to go somewhere, and you're writing SQL code. SQL is one of the ugliest languages, and it's been around since like the 1970s. Luckily, most of the SQL has remained the same, like select star from, whatever, like, but a lot of times your SQL queries are way more complex. I've seen stored procedures and things like that are like hundreds and hundreds of lines of code, if not thousands. And they're just mind-bogglingly complex. So you can't be a database expert, but if you ever chose to like be like, oh, I really love how columns and rows work and how to query, and if you were ever like really into that sort of thing, then you should probably focus on database design and development, because you could make a ton of money as a DBA. But again, if you're going to be a web developer and you're going to be focusing on more of like the back-end server, like virtual private host type of thing, then you're not really going to be like a SQL expert, really. Like if you want to be a SQL expert, you kind of have to devote yourself to being a SQL expert. Kind of like C++. A lot of people are like, oh, I'm going to learn C++. Like it takes like 10 years to learn C++. So even for good developers. So the next piece that you're going to want to focus on is the skills needed to actually pass the interview process. So once you have the actual skills you need, that's only half the battle, because then you have to actually prove that you have those skills. And different, interviewing environments, there's just no way to actually prove your skills, and just so many things that play into that. But there are a lot of games that are played by different software companies as to what to expect during the interview process. That changes all the time. The best way to stay up to date on that is to follow YouTubers like myself, or you can go to HackerRank to kind of practice some of the algorithms that are being talked about. Another great opportunity is to just go to Glassdoor.com. Glassdoor will give you all kinds of information about different companies in the area, and people will talk about the hiring process. So the larger the company, the easier it is to find out information. Another thing too is that a lot of people these days are actually reaching out on LinkedIn to people that work for companies to get the scope on, or the scoop really on what the company's like, what it's like to work there. What is the dress code? What is it more laid back, or is it more like, business professional type of thing? So like a lot of stuff has to be looked into when it comes to how to interview at the company, because different companies are going to interview differently for, and that can be a skill on its own. All right, so the next thing you should probably be comfortable with is software design fundamentals or principles. And really, it's just the software design lifecycle. So Agile methodology is the most popular software methodology or software development methodology right now. Every company, it seems like, is using it. They do things like, these Agile Scrum environments where you have these Scrum teams where everybody gives their status every day and talks about what they're working on, what their blockers are, things like that. And it's a really collaborative type of thing where like large tasks are broken down into much smaller finite pieces for better tracking and things like that. But unfortunately, there is no perfect solution, but this is the most popular. So I would recommend you at least pick up one book on Agile methodology, read through it, and understand how to at least talk about Agile and what it is and why it exists and things like that. Maybe understand the difference between Agile and Waterfall and things like that. Now, this one might rub people the wrong way, but most companies in the United States, at least, are running Microsoft products. They're running Microsoft operating systems. They're using things like MS Excel or Microsoft Excel and Microsoft Outlook. I've never actually had a corporate gig where I wasn't using a Microsoft email system to communicate with other people. So this new Microsoft Teams is like a new product from Microsoft. If you guys have the money or the interest or desire, like I would recommend that you do spend some time, because there's nothing worse than going in and starting a job and they give you an Excel spreadsheet and they expect you to do some like calculations on that. Oh, you're a programmer, you don't know how to use Excel? What do you mean? I'll just Google that real quick. You could spend all day learning how to write, some basic Excel. So if you have time, just understand that most professional development environments are going to be using a lot of these core tools. PowerPoints for presentations, know how to write a decent letter, using Word, Excel, and then just understanding, basic email system like Outlook and stuff like that can be helpful for starting a job, assuming you do actually land your first job, because I think that does throw people through a loop sometimes, is just kind of learning those tools. But really, it's just a couple days and you're good to go. But if you could get a heads up on that, you might as well. All right, so I could actually talk about this all day. I feel like I've already gone on 25 minutes and I have way more to talk about on this, so I'll probably have to make this into multiple videos. But that's really, off the top of my head, those are the most important features that jumped out at me, and I'm sure that there's going to be 10 more as soon as I stop this recording. But anyway, guys, let me know what you think. Let me know what I'm missing on this, and make sure you subscribe. Have a good day. Bye.